Welcome to this webinar focused on effective practices for addressing disproportionate representation of special ed students in the area of autism. On behalf of the IDOE, I'd like to welcome you to this discussion. This is one of a series of webinars that is offered as part of the department's collaboration with the IDRC. The IDRC is a collaborative effort between the Equity Project at IU, the center that's led disproportionality efforts in the state for many years, the Rowan Corporation, who facilitates the development of many of the electronic resources that will be available to you across the year, and Virtuoso Education Consulting. My name is Renee Aziz, and I am the Director of Professional Development for Virtuoso, and we will be leading the technical assistance work provided to corporations like you that are in need of support. So again, thank you for joining this webinar. We appreciate your time. Materials for today's webinar are located at the tiny URL address seen here. The slides that we will cover today can be found there, along with many supplemental resources that I'll refer to across the webinar. We've got a full agenda plan. Today, I'd like to begin our discussion with a brief overview of what we know about the prevalence of autism and a discussion of why that information is important to know. Then I'd like to shift our attention to those things that we can do at the local level to address disproportionality. Specifically, I'd like to discuss the issue of medical versus educational diagnosis. I'd like to highlight best practices in educational evaluations of autism and then share some considerations regarding the impact of culture on autism. We will end our discussion today with some information about your next steps as you prepare to submit your corrective action plan to the Department of Education. As we go along, we'll have planned opportunities for you to engage in some activities and reflections related to the content presented. It's really important that you take time to engage in discussions with your colleagues at these times and identify how the content connects to your corporation specifically. Let's start with a discussion about the prevalence of autism. In March 2014, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention released their most recent estimate of the prevalence of autism spectrum disorder among children aged 8 years old. Their startling finding was that 1 in 68 children in the United States met criteria for autism spectrum disorder in 2010. This was compared to the rate of 1 in 88 in 2008, 1 in 110 using data from 2006, and 1 in 150 in 2002. These dramatic increases have raised many concerns regarding the possible causes of autism. When we look closer at the CDC prevalence data, we find that the prevalence gap between white and black children is actually closing, but the gap between Hispanics and other ethnicities is staying about the same. But there are some methodological problems associated with the methods used by the CDC to estimate the prevalence of autism. The CDC conducts surveillance studies to estimate prevalence of autism. To describe the process briefly, the CDC uses a protocol to review the medical and educational records of children, looking specifically for indicators of autism in these records. It's important to note that no direct evaluation of children is completed in this process. Through the process, there are stark variances that have been highlighted regarding the rates of autism across gender, across race, and across comorbid disabilities. Some have suggested that while helpful, the data collected by the CDC are not accurate representations of prevalence data at all. Mandel and LeCavalier suggest that without direct assessment of children whose records are reviewed, we cannot know the extent to which these records include false positives, meaning the child is identified with autism but is not truly autistic. And we also have no way of assessing false negatives, meaning when children should be identified with autism but are not. I have added this article to the materials folder. Additionally, I'm not saying that we should ignore prevalence rate. I am suggesting that we need to understand the ways in which these data are collected in order to know how to best use them. So you may be wondering or thinking, well, why is this important? Well, without clarity on the true prevalence of the disorder, we're really aiming for targets that may or may not be accurate as we seek to address disproportionality. So you might experience some of your colleagues that will argue that a citation of noncompliance for disproportionality in autism is unfair because the national trends related to higher prevalence among white children in autism are real, right? They have those numbers. However, what if we don't have the accurate data on the frequency of the disorder across other ethnicities? Given these complexities, I advocate that our policies and our practices should really aim to ensure accurate identification rather than intentionally or our primary intention be on addressing disproportionality alone. I believe that given the challenges associated with relying on those published prevalence rates, again, a focus on ensuring that our identification practices are adequate is the way to go. And with that, for the remainder of this webinar, I'd like to focus in on the practices that we can implement to facilitate accurate identification. Let's start with thinking about differences in medical and educational diagnoses of autism. One reason for the discrepancy in finding children who qualify for autism may come from differing criteria used by the medical and educational communities. The medical community uses criteria described in the DSM-5, whereas as educational personnel, we use criteria outlined in Article 7. Parents and educators often equate receiving a medical diagnosis of autism with being qualified or with qualifying for autism under special education. This confusion often arises because a child can be found eligible under one set of criteria but not under the other. And although both criteria rely on behavioral observations to determine eligibility, they both still leave room for personal impressions to affect the final diagnosis and eligibility determination. The lack of a consistent screening tool used to determine if a child qualifies for autism may play a role in this lack of consensus. Recently, the Department of Education published a document highlighting the difference between medical diagnoses and educational eligibility. That's what you're looking at here. This document is available in the materials folder for your reference, and I encourage you to review the document and share it widely with parents, community groups, and medical professionals. So, as practitioners, what should we do to address these differences? Well, there are several things that I believe are important. First, we need to ensure that we are effectively partnering with family groups and community agencies to address the issue of autism. We need to identify parent groups that are different across various cultural, racial, and ethnic groups, and think about how we can partner with these groups regarding dissemination of information about autism. And if we find that there are groups that are not active across various cultural groups, we need to focus on ways to mitigate those challenges regarding their participation. We need to engage with someone from the cultural community for guidance on how we can reach our target populations and use those folks as liaisons. Another meaningful thing that we can do to address the medical and educational eligibility gap is to look at our policies and procedures. We can strengthen our collaboration by identifying our strategies with child find and early intervention. For me, this is a key element. Children should be screened regularly for autism, and we know that this is less likely to occur in communities of color and low-income populations, as well as among parents who do not speak English as their primary language. So as practitioners, we need to consider whether or not we can offer screenings through Child Find, for example. What about through our traditional kindergarten entrance screenings? We can also think about our existing structures for RTI and MTSS and think about to what degree our educators have the knowledge that they need to identify these indicators associated with autism so that we can then begin to take a closer look. I encourage you to look at your data to ascertain the patterns for referral in your district, meaning how are students typically referred for an evaluation for autism? Is it driven by parents? Is it driven by teachers? Is it driven by behavioral challenges a student experiences? Look at the trends associated with your data, and using the data, that will help you pinpoint how to strengthen your policies and procedures. And speaking of procedures, accountability checks are important as we review our practices objectively. So I encourage districts who've been cited for disproportionality in this area to conduct both intentional and random file reviews. Initially, I think it's important to review the appropriateness of students who are currently identified under the eligibility area of autism. Take another look at the files and the records of those students and think about how they have some indicators that might need or prompt a need to reconsider that eligibility area. You're looking for red flags in the file, much like the process that happens in the file review associated with determining noncompliance. But subsequent to those intentional reviews, I also think conducting random file reviews to ensure effective evaluations is also important. So if you use established protocols for this process, that's going to be an essential aspect that will help you know whether or not your practices are standard across all practitioners. And I'll share with you a checklist that you might use for this process a little later in the webinar. I also think that using an eligibility certification process like what we use for SLD could be helpful in this area of autism. So here's an example of what we often use as a certification checklist for something like the specific learning disability. Notice that the checklist captures the essential components of an SLD evaluation, and at the bottom it explicitly seeks the perspective of each member of the case conference team. So while this is not a requirement for evaluations for autism, I think that using this format could be a good way for you to ensure alignment of the M team members and to ensure accurate identification of students under the eligibility area of autism. So now I'd like to give you an opportunity to think and talk about the concepts that we've covered so far. Specifically, I'd like for you to discuss your current reality, and by that I mean the number of students who are currently identified under the eligibility area of autism. What can you say about eligibility across subgroups? Now, we know that white students are overrepresented, but what's the nature of underrepresentation in your corporation? Also discuss whether students currently identified have medical diagnoses that prompted the evaluation, or if the student was evaluated initially by you as the school corporation. Discuss how those trends related to eligibility may have changed over time. And then, after really talking through your data, I'd like for you to consider the root causes that you've identified based on those factors, and as a result, what action steps you can identify. Now let's talk a little bit about best practice in evaluation for autism. As I've alluded to a few times throughout the webinar already, when you're thinking about best practices to address disproportionality in autism, we're really dealing with two sides of the same coin. We have to consider the accuracy of the eligibility decisions we make for white students who are currently overrepresented in the data, but we also have to think about the possibility of under-identification of other ethnic groups. The reality is children whose families have more financial resources, healthcare providers who are more knowledgeable about autism, have access to advocacy groups that are likely to identify autism early. All of that access to those kinds of resources can lead to overrepresentation in autism. But in contrast, there are some real racial disparities resulting from those factors as well. So disparities result from experiences and competency levels of healthcare providers, which are often more limited for families of color. Also important differences are related to the access to autism screenings and lack of parental advocacy. Additionally, sometimes we notice that educational agencies may be more willing to agree with healthcare provider diagnoses, again, leading to over and underrepresentation of target groups. Additionally, we cannot minimize the possibility of unconscious biases that can impact diagnosis of the disorder. And truthfully, as much as we all would like to assert that children are found eligible based on a certain set of criteria, the fact remains that behavioral observations are required to identify these patterns. And anytime you have observations, you open the door to subjectivity. And all of the research on bias strongly supports the conclusion that although we all have biases, most of us are completely unaware of our biases, and even fewer of us think that our biases can negatively affect or impact others. So given that, we really have to engage in explicit conversations about the ways in which our observations of behavior may be impacting our lenses. And at the same time, we need to ensure that we have procedures in place that would limit the impact of our biases. So some of the things that will help with that include a solid multidisciplinary teaming process at both the pre-referral and the evaluation level. So we want to make sure that our early intervention teams include team members with a range of knowledge, a range of areas of expertise, and a range of perspectives so that these multiple points of view can help us identify students who may be expressing behaviors aligned with autism in both traditional and non-traditional ways. Additionally, we need to ensure that our evaluation teams also include those with multiple perspectives, not just differing areas of expertise. And in my experience as a practitioner, I really believe that we feel like we've got that piece covered as it relates to our evaluation teams. We feel like we don't need to work on that aspect because we ensure that our M teams or our evaluation teams include the school psychologist, the SLP, the OT, PT. We even bring in our autism consultants. We've got lots of differing roles involved. But I just like to take some time to push back on that a little bit and encourage you to consider the degree to which those team members, although they have a wide range of roles, think about the degree to which those team members share differing perspectives and to what extent those practitioners are knowledgeable about cultural differences that might be important. Another strategy for reducing the influence of bias in your evaluations is to use an eligibility checklist that's aligned to the DSM-5 criteria. Now, Article 7 guidelines are fairly broad and checklists that take into consideration language from Article 7 alone without considering how these criteria align with the DSM-4 may lead to increased disconnects between medical and educational determinations of autism. So I'd like to share with you a checklist that I helped a local school district develop based on the DSM-5 criteria. So we made sure that all members of the evaluation team understood the elements of the checklist, and also inter-rater reliability checks are really important to complete as practitioners begin to use the checklist. I've observed that many districts will have a checklist, but then they don't really train people on how to use the checklist. And if they do the training, they don't really go take that next step of ensuring inter-rater reliability on the use of the tool. Here you can see that the overall characteristic that we're looking for is highlighted in bold, and following that are indicators and illustrative examples of those impacted areas. For each of the impacted areas, team members must capture both the evidence that supports and the evidence that does not support the component. We followed this pattern for each of the eligibility criteria outlined in the DSM-5. So here, the last page of the checklist helps us pay particular attention to comorbid disabilities such as cognitive and language impairments, as well as other medical conditions that might be important to consider. Earlier in the webinar, I mentioned that file reviews are important tasks for districts that have been cited for noncompliance. And we talked about the need to do those file reviews both intentionally and unprompted in order to ensure fidelity of your procedures. Using a checklist similar to this, again, you can use this one or one that you create in your own district, will really support that file review process. At this time, I'd like for you to take some time to discuss your policies, your practices, and procedures for the ways in which you conduct autism evaluations in your corporation. So consider whether or not evaluations of students with medical diagnoses, what that process is like, but also consider the process for students that you complete initial evaluations with. Maybe those things are the same, but talk about that. How do you know they're the same? How might they be different? Also think about how you ensure that the fidelity of your policies, practices, and procedures are what you want them to be. Think about your areas of strength, things you do well as opportunities for growth that might be evidenced by gaps related to fidelity. And the final area that I'd like to discuss with you is related to the ways in which we need to consider culture's impact on autism. In the materials that I've shared with you, I've included a 2013 article by Harris and colleagues, which investigates the cultural relevance of some of our most utilized assessments for autism evaluation. Dr. Harris is a trained school psychologist. In fact, Bryn and I were actually in graduate school together at Indiana University. And what I appreciate about the work that she and her colleagues did was that they analyzed the relevance and the appropriateness of the tools that we often just consider the gold standards of evaluation for autism. The checklist that they created is intended to be used to help us as practitioners make decisions about which assessment tools we should use with culturally and linguistically diverse students. and when we may need to identify necessary adaptations and exercise caution in our interpretations of assessment results. The checklist that they developed has 16 indicators, and they're all listed here. These indicators represent the quality indicators that assessment should meet in order to be considered culturally and linguistically relevant. Now, I'm going to take time to read these so that the next few slides that we discuss will be more meaningful to you. So again, the 16 indicators include, number one, that the assessment has a normative sample that includes sufficient percentages based on the U.S. Census of culturally and linguistically diverse children with autism. The normative sample includes English language learners with autism. Number three, the technical report or manual includes utility information from consumers, meaning people who use the assessment, including practitioners and parents. The procedures of the assessment support obtaining family input regarding the child's functional repertoire, including daily routines and natural settings with familiar children and adults. The procedures support obtaining information from additional caregivers or service providers about the child's behavior. Number six, the procedures include observations in natural settings. The procedures include specific adaptations for culturally, linguistically diverse children and families. The procedures include obtaining adequate information about the child and the family's language proficiency and the child's language dominance. Number nine, the procedures include obtaining adequate information regarding the child's functional communication skills in his or her native or dominant language, if that's other than English. The assessment requires information about the child's functional communication skills in authentic context, meaning daily routines at home. Number 11, procedures include obtaining adequate information regarding the child's functional social skills in authentic context. Procedures include guidelines for using an interpreter. 13, procedures include guidelines for using translated test materials. The assessment includes gathering information about the child's nonverbal skills that are not related to language comprehension. So this might include observing the child independently play with blocks or putting a puzzle together. Number 15, the assessment promotes teamwork between the family and professionals. And lastly, the assessment promotes gathering information on a child and family's level of acculturation. Now, with those 16 criteria in mind, the researchers reviewed common diagnostic and screening assessments that we use now, such as the ADOS, the ADIR, the CARS, the ASQSE, the GARS, and the SCQ. So we don't have time to review each of those tools, but if you're not familiar with any of these, I encourage you to read the article by Harris and colleagues after today's webinar, and then follow up with me if you have additional questions or clarification points. I believe, though, that most of you are already familiar with these assessment tools. Results of the evaluation of these tools indicated significant weaknesses related to cultural relevance. For example, the ADOS only met 2 of the 16 criteria, and we all know that the ADOS is considered to be the gold standard for direct assessment of autism. The only CR characteristics that it fulfilled were related to criteria 4, which is related to family input, and criteria 14, which is about gathering info on nonverbal skills. That's, again, just an example of the ADOS, but thinking generally about the results of the criteria evaluation, overall scores on these assessments range from a 2 that the ADOS had to a 9, which was identified on the ASQSE. The ASQSE and the CARS performed the best on the checklist with scores of 9 and 8 respectively. But in general, the screening tools perform slightly better than the diagnostic tools on the checklist. The screening tools scored an average of 5.5, while the diagnostic tools averaged 5.3. Now, the diagnostic tools were most likely to meet indicators 6, 10, and 11. And those criteria are related to conducting observations in natural settings, and gathering information about the child's functional communication and social skills. All of the diagnostic tools scored a no on indicators 2, 3, 8, 9, 12, 13, and 16. So for example, indicator 2 requires the assessment tool use a normative sample, including English language learners. Indicator 3 states that the technical report for the tool should include utility information from consumers. Indicators 8 and 9 require that the assessment tool have procedures that include gathering information about the child and the family's dominant language and the child's functional communication skills in his or her dominant language. The screening tools, though, demonstrated a little more variability, except that all screeners scored a no on indicator 13, which had to do with standardized procedures or guidelines for using translated test materials, and indicator 16, which was about promoting the gathering of information regarding the child and the family's level of acculturation. The screening tools were most likely to meet indicator 10, which is related to requiring information about the child's functional communication skills in an authentic context, and criteria 11, which is about standardized procedures obtaining adequate information about the child's functional social skills in natural settings. Both screening and diagnostic tools were most likely to meet item 4, which is about procedures for getting family input regarding the child's behavior. So there are a few things to note here. I know that's a lot of information, but I feel like this checklist really challenges us as practitioners to think about the tools that we use in a different way. So as indicated here on the screen, in some cases, the tools have been updated since the time this article was published. So here's my challenge to you. It would be a good practice for you all to apply this checklist by looking at the revised assessments. I've done it, but what will you find? I want you to practice doing that. Additionally, while the total checklist is not yet validated for use by practitioners, practitioners really should consider these findings when identifying assessment practices for culturally and linguistically diverse students. And we should be utilizing this checklist as one piece of our evaluation process and procedure when selecting and interpreting what assessments we're going to use for what children. Now, as it relates to our cultural lenses, that's another thing that we really need to consider. We need to consider whether or not the ways that our evaluation team explicitly considers or makes adaptations for culture is what it needs to be. Are we really thinking about the ways in which culture may be impacting the expression of autism? As we've just uncovered, the tools that we currently use are insufficient in their cultural relevancy, and there's a lack of research on culturally different expressions of autism. So as a practitioner, I believe that we must engage in this work at the ground level. We don't have the resource yet to help us discern these differences, but our assessment practices that account for culturally and linguistically significant differences, we must make sure that our assessment practices are sufficiently sensitive to detect differences in the cultural expression of autism. That kind of research is desperately needed. I would say that another area that we need to look at with a cultural lens is related to the eligibility areas that we assign differentially. So this concept is referred to as diagnostic eligibility substitution. In general, the research, which actually comes mostly from the medical field, indicates that Black students are more likely to be identified as other health impaired because of some attention issues, more likely to be identified as emotionally disturbed or cognitively disabled. In contrast, Hispanic students are more likely to be identified as cognitively disabled. So the checklist that we just reviewed around the file review can really help us make sure that we are considering all of the evidence, both the evidence that supports and that evidence that does not support autism. By using that checklist, we can make sure that we're making the most accurate decisions in this very complex decision-making process. At this time, I'd like for you to digest all that information. I know it was a lot. Specifically, I want you to discuss the tools that you're commonly using in your corporation for evaluation of autism. I want you to review the checklist criteria that are unmet according to the research by Harris and colleagues, and think about, if those things are unmet, how might you address those areas? Also, spend some time thinking about your evaluation team. Does your team have the cultural knowledge that they need to ensure awareness of culturally mediated behaviors? If you say yes to that, how do you know it? And if not, how are you going to build that knowledge around your assessment team members? Finally, let's conclude the webinar with a look at your next steps. I'd like you to develop a plan for addressing your takeaways and your identified actions based on today's discussion. Now, you might need to reconsider your previously identified actions regarding data and root causes as discussed in previous webinars, given your discussions today. All of those tasks that you identify can be a part of your corrective action plan, which is due to the Department of Education next month. Here is the CAP template that you are likely familiar with at this point. Be sure to be specific about your actions when you're identifying them on this template. Also, it's essential that you ask yourself this question: how will the activities that we've identified directly impact our area of noncompliance? It shouldn't be a stretch to answer this question, and if it is, you really want to revisit the activities that you've identified and think about root causes more fully. And as always, for additional support, you've got lots of support resources here. Be sure to refer to the IDRC website, which is coming soon. We'll let you know when it goes live. We've also listed here contacts for the Department of Education, the Equity Project, and for us at Virtuoso. Feel free to reach out to any of us with additional questions. And as another point, I'd be happy to review your corrective action plan before you submit it to the department if you believe that will be helpful to you and your colleagues. Thank you for listening to this webinar. We hope that the information has been helpful. Best wishes to you and your colleagues as you continue the journey of addressing disproportionality in your district.